How many of you Line 6 Helix and HX Stomp users have ever come across this extremely frustrating situation? All right, here I am just going to finish up this little simple preset I've been working on. I've got a stereo LA Studio comp and a stereo dynamic hall, and I've got my poly pitch, which I really need. And I'm just going to add my amp and cab, but I can't select that for some reason. Let's go to the amp alone here, and everything's grayed out. I can't seem to select anything. How many of you have ever run across that incredibly frustrating situation? Well, what you've run into is basically the Helix or the HX Stomp running out of processing power. We've run out of the ability to add any more blocks to our preset because we've used up all the processing power that is within it. Are there any solutions to this? Well, this is a question I receive a lot, and I figured it was about time to do a video about it. I see it asked a lot in internet forums, and people that are maybe especially new to the Helix may not understand why this is happening. I know a lot of folks who will be watching this do understand it. They've been with the Helix for a while, and they know exactly how to fix this problem too. Fix it within the boundaries of what our hardware can actually accomplish. So what do we do to fix this when we run out of processing power in the Helix? Or maybe the question is, have we actually run out of processing power, or do we just think we have? Well, there are a couple things we can look into and educate ourselves about if we don't already know that can help us to get a little bit more out of the Helix. So let's go over to HX Edit and see if we can't actually get this sorted out a little bit so that we can maybe squeeze a little bit more out of the Helix and accomplish what it is we're trying to do. So here we are over in HX Edit. And as I mentioned, once we get to this point where we are trying to select a block that isn't there, it's simply because there is not enough processing power left in the Helix or HX Stomp to accomplish that. It just cannot load this. So it tells us that. It can be a very frustrating thing. Well, how can we go about solving this problem or fixing it? Helix users have a little more flexibility because we basically have twice the processing power that the HX Stomp users have. Or we have two processors versus the one processor that HX Stomp users have to be able to use. But before I go on, I want to point you to one of the finest resources for Line 6 Helix, HX Stomp, and PodGo users out there. Anyone who is a frequent reader or user of the Line 6 Helix Facebook official group will know a fellow by the name of Ben Vesco. Ben's a really nice fellow. I've had the opportunity to chat a couple times with him online, and a really great fellow. Well, he has done something very interesting that I think is one of the coolest things out there for the Helix. And he has created this little DSP Allocation Chart. And here is the URL for that, benvesco.com/store/helix-dsp-allocations. I'm going to try to remember to put a link to that in the description of this video. If I don't, please scream at me in the comments and I will add it there. I will try to remember to do that though. And if we read what this is about, it says Helix DSP allocations. The values in the tables below are the upper limit of DSP reserved for each block. The numbers are not an indication of processing horsepower required, but only describe how much DSP is quote unquote blocked out by Line 6 when determining how many blocks to allow in a preset. So we can see that this will give us some sort of idea of which blocks we're going to be able to combine together. And if for nothing else, it's very interesting to know which blocks will take up a little more processing power or prevent us from being able to add other blocks. So if we go through here, we'll notice that there's the extrapolated preamp and then the full amp version. And then he also has the PodGo versions as well. So really interesting stuff. So we see here something like the Stone Age 185 full amp model is a measure of 33.79, whereas the Supro is 19.41. So a little bit less DSP intensive for that one. And as we scroll down, we see a lot of them are in the same ballpark. Something like the US Small Tweed, much less, and even just using the preamp model doesn't really save us much in that particular case, whereas with others it does. If we keep scrolling down though, we also get to some of our other types of blocks such as delays and modulation effects, and we have the mono and the stereo versions. And you'll notice in a lot of cases the stereo versions are going to take up a lot more of our DSP than the mono versions. Keep that in mind, and we'll take a look closer to that in just a second. We also have the PG or the PodGo cost as well. So we can go through and notice that something like the Cosmos Echo takes up quite a bit of the DSP, whereas a transistor tape a little bit less, whereas something like the simple delay, much, much less as well. So, we can use this to kind of plan out our presets even before we start looking at them. And the more we look at this table, we can kind of get an idea of which blocks are going to be a little bit more of a DSP hog than others. Something like the legendary drive we see takes up quite a bit more DSP. So thank you so much, Ben. I think it's an amazing thing you've done here, and I think we all owe Ben a great debt of gratitude for this. And go give him some support on his site and check this out and give him a thank you. So thank you from me personally, Ben, as well. So let's put some of this to use then. So we come over and I see I can't get any guitar amp in here right now. Well, one thing we could do, as we've learned from Ben's chart, is we could maybe change these to mono versions of the effects. And if you notice, I had 2 stereo versions. Now, some folks might say, well, that's not going to do me any good simply because I need stereo. Well, in that case, we'll have to use a different method to get a little more processing power out of it. But let's see what happens by simply changing those to 2 mono versions. We now come back over here and you will actually notice that I do get a couple amps back. Now, I know that's not much, right? But I can get a US small tweed in there. I could get the Roland Jazz chorus model we have in there. I know if you wanted something else that's not a great consolation, we do get some of our preamps here that we can still access. So, I mean, you might say, well, that didn't do much for me. And no, I agree with you that it didn't do a whole lot, but it did at least give us the ability to access a little more processing power. And maybe depending on the situation you're in, then maybe if we change from a stereo block to a mono block, that it will free up space for something else. In this case, not too much in the way of amps, but it is a possibility. And the first thing we could look at as a compromise to allow us to get a little more of our processing power up. Now, the next tip is not going to be any good for HX Stomp users simply because they only have the one processor to work with. What a lot of people don't realize about the Helix, though, is the 2 Helix processors that we do have are split between path 1A and path 2A. So this path up here, when utilizing only this path, we are only utilizing one of the processors in the Helix, and we are basically only getting half the processing power. And I know that this is a problem because I've been asked this a lot, and I've helped a lot of folks with this in the past, so I think it's a really important point to bring out. If we can utilize both paths, we're going to double our processing power. So you might say, how do we do this? Well, right now we're set up so that we have our input block. Let's say our guitar was plugged in here. I have it set to multi, but let's say we're using this as guitar. And we have an output block, and we're going out, and this path is totally out of the equation at this point. Well, if I come to my final output block of path 1A here, you'll notice I can choose to send that signal to path 2A. So let's do just that. So what's happening now is we have our guitar coming in here, going through this whole signal chain, hitting this output block, and that's just feeding it to path 2A, which will then feed it along here out to our final destination that we have set at the output block. So by doing this, I could do something like this now. I could take, let's go back to our stereo blocks on these. I could move these down by simply dragging and dropping them. I'm just going to get rid of this amp block. And you'll now notice that those didn't switch over because I think there wasn't the processing power to let them do so. So now we have 2 stereo blocks. You'll now notice I have my poly pitch up here still. I'm still going to have the same sound because I'm just feeding the signal through here, down, back through the exact same path. Now if I choose this, I can go to my amps, and what do you know? There's all my amps back. Amps and cabs. Now you'll notice I don't get all my amps and cabs back. So you could say, well, the amp I want is here with the cab I want. So I'm going to choose that and we're good to go. Now you're going to probably find that you're going to be a little limited in what else you can add to this. But I would say that whatever you can still add to this, if it's in the right place in the path, I would add to it simply for the fact that we want to utilize as much of the DSP that is left here. So you notice we do have some things grayed out, but we still can use certain effects, and we just got to kind of balance between the 2 paths, kind of squeeze out the most out of the processing. But let's say we're not even happy with this because that's not the amp I wanted. Let's say we come down to amp and cab and we wanted the German Mahadiva, let's say, and we see it's still grayed out. Well, I can go to just the amp, find the German Mahadiva, and then come down here maybe and throw the cab that I want down here instead. So that's an option too. You know, now you have all this space here between the amp and the cab, so you might not want to put something in there, or maybe you do. So you see, there is going to be some compromise to get this to work the way we want, depending on what it is that we're trying to accomplish. So that is a really useful tip that I know a lot of folks don't realize is there. And I think it's probably one of the more important things to know when utilizing the Helix, because it's a real shame if we're only utilizing half the power that we have at our disposal. So I hope that answers a couple questions that I get a lot. First of all being, why are my effects grayed out? Why can't I select them? And second of all, why do I run out of processing power so fast? You know, if we're a Helix user, like I said, if we now understand that we can balance between the two processors by using both paths, that can be a real game changer for the folks who didn't realize that. And now they've basically doubled their power as far as using their Helix. For HX Stomp users, obviously that's not much help, as we're stuck with the one processor. It's a much smaller unit, obviously with less feature set than the Helix has, but that's kind of the point. It's also a much lower price point. But we could possibly use that idea of switching stereo effects to mono effects, and that will help us to eke out just a little bit more processing power. And who knows, maybe that puts you over the edge and gives you just enough for what you need to finish whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. I hope that that was helpful. If anybody else has any cool ideas that I haven't thought of for possibly using and managing DSP in a different fashion, please leave the comments below. It's always great to hear everybody's different ideas so that we can all learn from those. Thank you guys so much again for tuning in. Please like the video, share it with anybody who you think would get some use out of watching it. Also, please subscribe to the channel and hit the little bell notification to get notified when I put new content out. I'll be back really soon with some more. Thank you guys so much for tuning in as usual. Ciao for now.